Welcome to the February Reimagining Retirement interview. And I'm so delighted today to welcome Maggie Rowe as our interviewee. And she and I are both members of the Red Bud Writers Guild. And we've recently connected most strongly over issues like retirement, ageism, and the desire to use our skills and our experience to the glory of God at any and all ages. So I'm just thrilled to introduce Maggie Rowe. So Maggie Rowe is an MABS. She's a national speaker, dramatist, and author from Western North Carolina. She's married 45 years to her pastor husband, Mike, mother of 3, grandmother to 6. And Maggie's work includes decades of public relations, adult education, and ministry to women. She served as an adjunct communications professor at Daniel Webster University in New Hampshire and Wheaton College in Illinois. She's published 2 books, The Life We Share and Life is Sweet, Y'all. And Maggie's also a TEDx presenter. She's a member of Red Bud Writers Guild and has served in the faculty of National Writers Conferences. And she blogs weekly at A View from the Ridge. And I'll put her links to her website and her TEDx talk on my newsletter. So welcome, Maggie. I'm just so thrilled that you have given us the benefit of your time and your wisdom and your experience to Reimagining Retirement.
Thank you, Judy. It's really a pleasure to be here because, as I commented, I think on one of your recent newsletters, I think you and I speak the same language and have many of the same concerns. And we are not alone. I think the last time I looked up statistics, there are at least 47 million Americans over 65. That's just in America. I think we're the fastest growing population out there. So we're the majority these days. So and, we're the age everybody aspires to be.
Yes, that's right. That's what I keep telling myself.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you've had such a variety of interesting careers. You've been in PR, teaching, writing, speaking. So can tell us a little bit more about your education and your careers, maybe how you got from one career to the other.
Oh, thank you. Well, I certainly can't say I had a plan, Judy. Thankfully, God did, because I really didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
You know, I went to high school in the late 60s, went to college in the early 70s. And as many my age have commented, especially women, we didn't hear a whole lot about career options. In fact, I think there wasn't a whole lot of, we had guidance counselors, but that was more for college prep. In terms of career, other than just jobs being posted, there wasn't nearly the vocational preparation, especially if you went to liberal arts college. It might have been different if you're at a vocational school, but liberal arts college, it was an excellent education. That I went to a Christian college that was very biblically rooted and academically rigorous. Very grateful for that. But in my mind, there didn't seem to be many career options for women other than medicine, especially nursing, or education, mainly being a teacher. And those are 2 fantastic professions. I have no skill at medicine whatsoever, but I have been a teacher. And there is no more noble profession out there, obviously, in terms of being an influencer in the best sense. So that's great. But it was hard to think beyond that. So for me, Judy, I knew what I loved was words, anything with words, writing them, reading them, acting them out, speaking them on the radio. I just loved words, but I wasn't sure what I could do with that other than teach others. I knew that acting was not a career as much as I loved it. I knew enough about the demands of the lifestyle to know it really wasn't consistent with how I wanted the rest of my life to go. So the only acting I did pre-children was summer stock, a little bit of professional theater or voiceovers, which I enjoyed, but that kind of stopped when the first child came along, because the life of an actor is very difficult if you want to devote yourself to your children also. But all that to say is that amazingly, I kind of stumbled into teaching. I did not have a good experience student teaching, sadly, and that my college prepared me well, but the cooperating teacher, as we call it. Was
your education, and did you get a teaching degree?
Thank you, I did. Secondary, because again, that was kind of the option. If I was a speech communication major, and what do you do with that? I wasn't sure. So the backup degree was secondary education, thinking maybe I could teach in high school, but my student teaching was not a good experience. The kids were great. The school was fine. The cooperating teacher was very uncooperative. So that's a long story I won't go into, but it kind of steered me away from wanting to teach on the secondary level. But then amazingly, what happened, and only God could do this, back when I was doing summer stock and doing temporary work, somebody told me that a nearby private university that only offered degrees, Bachelor of Science, not arts, they offered public speaking and business writing as required courses, but right before their semester was beginning, and this was a college in the town where I was living, they had a faculty member break their contract, and they had to fill those courses. So I went in for an interview, and Judy, I only had a bachelor's degree, and I was 26. So only a few years older than the students I'd be teaching, but because of my alma mater had an excellent academic reputation. The dean was desperate. He hired me for one semester, and it was such a good, it was such a good experience, and they were happy with my work. They kept me on for the next 9 years. But I have to laugh because I ended up teaching on the college level for almost a decade. When I was barely older than the students I was teaching. But it was a skills class, and I was adjunct. So that's how I launched into my first career. Only God could have gotten me that. And thankfully, it's because the dean happened to admire the college I went to, even though it was a Christian college and he was not a believer. So God put me in a strategic place where there were only a handful of Christian students, and I was able to mentor the women, and another male faculty member mentored the men. And it was a great first career. So, if there are younger people listening to us, and I hope there are, I'd really want to encourage them to be open. God can open doors that you could never open for yourself. So that's how I got into my first career, which was higher education.
Good job. Yeah, and you're right. God opens plenty of doors, and if we're looking for them, when we see them, we can walk through them. If we're kind of clueless and not paying attention, we might miss them.
Exactly.
I'm sure I missed a lot of them in my life because I was clueless for many years.
Well, I think we all are, and there's so many roads we can travel down. But one thing my husband taught me, he always said, Maggie, don't you be the one to say no. You may think, oh, I'll never apply for that because I'd never get it. He said, let them turn you down. Don't turn yourself down. We'll talk more about that as we talk with ageism. I think that's even more important as we get older, to not shut the door. If it's going to shut,
absolutely right.
Let somebody else do it.
Yeah. Good point. All right, let's go. Let's move on. So your husband was a pastor.
Yes.
And so I'm sure you did a lot of volunteering as a pastor's wife. And you probably did a lot of formal and informal volunteering.
Yes.
So describe some of the volunteering that you did, and how that influenced your perspective.
Thank you.
On life.
Yes, well, he was my husband Mike was a full-time pastor for over 40 years. We served 3 churches over that 40 plus years. Very fortunate to be able to have a long tenure at each of them. So during those years, we were the years that our children were born. So between the work of the church and raising a family, and then I had some paid employment during that time, I had very little time for volunteering other than within the church. So most of my volunteer work was with women in the churches we served, which then actually led to second career. You mentioned that I've done a lot of women's ministries. I actually, back in the 90s, joined the staff of a regional Christian organization. I call it a mission agency run by New Englanders for New Englanders. And that was a paid position, although I had to raise the salary myself. But it was mostly volunteer because I raised a very minimal amount, really just enough to kind of pay expenses and gas mileage and so forth. But it's interesting, Judy, that volunteer work is often what qualifies us to do other paid employment. And that's what it did for me. But I'll have to say is, as a woman in my 70s, as I look back on my volunteer work, it was mainly in Christian circles. It was mission trips and working with volunteers, primarily women within the churches we served. Now that I'm older, I'm thinking those are still important. In fact, my husband is on the pastoral staff of the church that we joined after retirement as a volunteer. And I think, as you know, we're leaving for Norway very soon to do 9 weeks of volunteer work there. in a pastoral sense. But I'm also committed, Judy, in this season of my life, I want to do volunteer work in areas where Christians are not as well represented. And that may mean things that a lot of us always thought as more liberal, you know, like creation care. Christians, we like to call it creation care because it was the first job we were ever given to do in the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
I put you here in the garden, take care of it.
Yeah.
But somehow, or environmental education has become so polarized politically that Christians sometimes shy away from it. So just as an example, for 3 years in a row, I've done a polar plunge in our community. I guess it's a way of raising money for a local county agency that is trying to ensure that we keep clean water for the generations to come. Now, years ago, I may have thought, oh, that's something that one political party more than another would be interested in. But as an independent, I don't think it should be politicized. No. So I decided I'm not athletic. I can't really run a race and raise money for a cause, but I can jump in a nice cold pool in the month of February. And amazingly, even as a almost 71-year-old, I ended up coming in first as the top fundraiser for this organization. Good. And got a beautifully framed plunger. This happened on Saturday. So I say that only because years ago, Judy, I would have thought, oh, I'll never do that. That's not my kind of thing. I'm only doing Christian work. Yeah. But these days I'm thinking I need to get involved in areas where there maybe aren't as many Christians because we need faith-based representation. Yes. And I don't want to separate it into this is sacred, this is secular. In God's economy, it's all sacred to him. Yep. So the kind of volunteering I'm doing now, I also testified recently when my state insurance commissioner, he was considering a proposal that they wanted to raise homeowners rates between 50 and 100% in our state. Wow. And AARP was looking for people who were willing to attend the hearings in our state capitol, which you could do physically or virtually, and speak out about this because it would be economically devastating for some of the people on fixed incomes. So I was willing to testify thinking, again, this is not a political thing. This is something that affects everybody. Yeah. And so that's the kind of volunteering I'm doing now. Great. Not within my church, but other areas. Yeah.
It's interesting that your perspective, or, maybe as we age, our perspectives grow. We're not quite so focused on, okay, this is Christian, that's secular.
Yes.
And I noticed the same thing. I'm much more open to areas that 30 or 40 years ago, I might not have been.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is too, because it's easy to stay in our bubble. It's a little more risky to go out and be in things where we don't have as many like-minded people, but we're more needed there too. We really are. Yes. Sometimes it's just our presence. Like I did a Martin Luther King march because at the end of it, I just wanted to be able to sit with African-American women and hear their stories from before the days of desegregation. And by my being there, did I do any good for anybody? No, but it was good for me to hear them.
Yeah.
So,
perfect.
volunteering.
Good examples. Good examples.
Yeah, a one-time event or ongoing, but anyway.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage people to think outside the box.
Yeah. So let's see. When did your husband and you, or maybe they're not the same time, when did you physically or actually retire?
Well, very conventionally, right at 65.
Okay.
And it's, as we've already talked about, I've had several careers. Everyone seemed to last about a decade. Higher education, a variety of jobs when I got out of college, higher education in the 80s, regional women's ministries in the 90s. Then I did public relations work, which was my get the last children through college job. I worked for a publishing company as a book publicist for many years. And that's the corporate job I retired from at 65, primarily because after 42 or 3 years of full-time pastoral ministry, we were really ready to step down at that point. We felt like we've taken the church we were with as far as we possibly can. And at 65, we were ready to do some new things. And we had worked and saved, and we wanted to relocate. So we decided together that I'd leave my corporate job. He would leave the pastorate. Okay. We would plan at least a year in advance so that our church could prayerfully look at their next step.
Right.
And then we moved here to North Carolina. And the sole reason for moving was, well, it's much cheaper than where we used to live in the suburbs of Chicago.
Yeah.
But it also was to live in a place of the country where we'd always been drawn.
Yeah.
And people
Yeah.
said to us, you'll probably be as busy or more in retirement as you were when you were working. And that's true. We are.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
it's not for a full-time salary anymore. In fact, usually no
Right.
salary at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay. So were there challenges when you first retired? Did you feel like, whoa, what am I going to do now? Or did you have time to think that all through before you retired?
yeah, we really did have time. For my husband, I know a lot of men, not to be sexist or put men and
Mhm.
women in a box, but because women, I'm sure as well, feel a loss of identity. I did
Sure.
not, because public relations was my third career, sort of, where I'd been in the same job for 9 or 10 years or more.
Yeah.
And I was ready to leave that
Hmm.
because the Christian publishing world had changed so much. There were just a lot fewer opportunities to place authors than
Hmm.
there ever had been. I was ready to be done. And my
Hmm.
husband was ready to step down. The one thing we completely agreed on was in retirement was saying, we want to come alongside younger people in ministry. That's an absolute missional thing for us,
Yeah.
which means
Yeah.
our local pastor here, helping
Hmm.
him in any way that we can. And that's why we're going to Norway to fill in for a pastor who will be traveling, helping to assist other international churches. And while he's away, we'll fill in for him.
Good.
But the challenges really were practical. And it wasn't a loss of identity. Uh,
Hmm.
Let me mention the challenges first, then the exciting part for me. The challenges were really losing our great corporate health insurance,
Yeah.
which we never
Yeah.
had to worry about. It was
Yeah.
all encompassing. It was
Right.
good. There
Right.
was a benefits administrator. So suddenly going on off that and then going on Medicare was like, whoa, this
Yeah.
is that's a big
Different.
adjustment.
Yeah.
You'd think if you have the ability to learn and maybe you have a college degree, or in our case, graduate degrees, Medicare shouldn't be hard to figure out. And it's surprisingly
Yeah.
challenging. I have great compassion for people who speak English as a second language, because
I
Medicare,
know.
even just getting enrolled, is
I know.
often need help. So I think the biggest challenge really was losing some of those corporate
Hmm.
benefits that we had
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
being completely on our own with that. The amazing thing for me is just 9 months before I retired, I signed my first book contract. And that's a long story in itself. I won't go into.
Yeah.
I I thought the way I wrote, I didn't think any traditional publisher would ever be interested, but in a very unusual way, through some of the volunteer work that I did,
Mhm.
not my position
Mhm.
in Christian publishing,
Yeah.
traditional publisher approached me and said,
Huh.
you've got a book in, and that's how my first book ended up being published. So
Huh.
when I
Interesting.
retired, I immediately plunged into writing this book. And then, as you know,
Yeah.
when you're an author, you've got to do a lot of the promotion and marketing yourself. Even if you're with a good sized publisher who has a marketing department and a PR
Mhm.
department, you
Mhm.
still have to do a lot yourself. So really the first 4 years of our retirement, I was consumed with writing and getting those first two books out and everything else that goes with it, teaching
Yeah.
at writers
Yeah.
conferences, joining Writing Guild, which is where
Mhm.
you and I met, uh, everything else that's part of the industry, as I'd have to
Good.
call it. It's a
Yeah.
ministry. It's also an industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, now that there's no book on the horizon, I'm starting to volunteer and do some different things that I
Okay.
couldn't when I was very consumed
Right.
with
Right.
writing. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Wonderful. Well, I watched your TEDx talk, which was
Oh,
great. And
uh,
and I would recommend everybody watch that. Everybody who's watching this, watch that. That was well worth the time.
yeah. Thank you.
It's very encouraging. And you mentioned that um, what we should focus on what we have and not what we lack, and that we should look at our gains and our losses as possibilities for what to do next. And so I'm curious, did you have specific situations or experiences that led you to that truth, or did that just come about some other way?
Well, I think that's really my life testimony, Judy.
Mm.
I've always struggled from low self-esteem. In fact, in my first book, This Life We Share, we talk about imposter syndrome, which is much more common than I ever thought. I thought it was just me. And it
No.
wasn't until literally our last trip to Norway 2 years ago, I realized that part of it's my ethnic heritage, that Norwegians are taught not to think too highly of themselves and never, ever to think they're better than anybody else in anything. It's called janteloven. It's a social code. But
Yeah.
I realized, sort of probably being raised that way, it was so important to Norwegian American parents that their kids never get a big head, that I honestly thought that I wasn't really good at anything. That wasn't my parents' fault. They were affirming.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was just something in me.
Yeah.
So because of that, I was always shocked when I did well at anything.
Mhm.
Uh, so when in 1991, 30 years ago, I was asked to join the staff of a regional Christian organization overseeing women's ministries in 6 states, I was terrified, Judy. I didn't seek the position. I was stunned to be asked. I had just started a ministry in our local church, and that was all I could manage. And then there were 2 things that helped. I remember saying to the Lord, but I know I've seen the woman in that position, and I think I lack about 90% of what that position requires. And it was as if I heard the voice of the Holy Spirit say, then go with the 10% you have, I'll supply the 90.
Interesting.
And the
Yeah.
other thing I heard him say is that, Maggie, the reason I'm putting you in this position is you can't intimidate anybody. Nobody can say, well, she's famous, or she has a well-known husband, or they have a big church.
Yeah.
The vast majority of churches in New England are like yours. They're
Yeah.
old, they're small. So nobody can be threatened by you. If there's certain things that your church is learning to do, you can teach those to others.
Mm.
So that's where I began to realize that we've got to look
Interesting.
at our life not by what we're lacking, because for most of us that we'd come up with a long list.
Quite a long list. Yes.
Yeah, and it's very biblical. What did
Mhm.
God say to Moses? What's that in your
Mhm.
hand? What
Yeah.
do you have
Yeah.
in your hand?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, Maggie, what do you have? Well, I have this. I don't have anything else.
Mhm.
Uh, and in fact, one other thing, Judy, that I'll never forget, the woman who I succeeded in my regional position in New England, she had pioneered the ministry, and she was a visionary and an entrepreneur. And I remember saying to her, Bev, I'm not you. I can't do what you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember her saying to me, Maggie, think about it this way. There's 2 kinds of people, 2 kinds of leaders. There are fire starters and there are wood carriers.
Mm.
She said, with God's help, I think we've lit a fire under the women here in New England to
Uh,
begin ministries to and for women. The fire, it's kindled. Now
mhm.
can you carry the wood to keep it
Mm.
going? And I
Mm.
remember thinking, I can carry the wood. I'm not a visionary. I'm not a leader. I'm not an entrepreneur, but I can carry the wood.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I can do.
Mm.
So I hope that will encourage somebody else. I've
Yeah.
never forgotten when she said it to me. So I
Interesting.
want to
Yeah.
say to
Yeah.
people, count your life by what you have, not by what you're missing. God will supply what you're
Yeah.
missing if this is what he has for you to
If
do.
that's what he wants you to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. That's awesome. I love that. You can carry the wood because I
Yeah.
often feel the same way. I feel like, well, I'm not the personality everybody's drawn to. I'm not the entrepreneur, but I'll just carry the wood, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
we do what we can with what we've
Yep.
got.
Yep.
And,
And God
and
does the rest.
that's right.
Thankfully. Thankfully. Oh, okay. Um, all right. You and I agree that ageism is an underreported, even culturally acceptable prejudice. And I'm embarrassed to admit that, I never really thought about ageism until maybe the last 5 years or so. And you said on the TEDx talk that you refer to ageism as a bias against your future self. So would you expand that thought a little bit for us?
Yes, I'd be happy to. That definition is not original with me. It's from Mary Pfeiffer, who's an author and
Mm.
psychologist. She's
Okay.
the author of a book. Actually, my marketing manager, when my first book was coming out, and I was, 65 when I signed the contract, 67 when the book released. She said there's a woman writing about issues. The book's called Women Rowing North, secular book. And I read it and I was just gripped by her definition when she said age discrimination, or she said ultimately ageism is a prejudice against one's own future self. And when I thought about that, I thought, wow, I think in a sense we all see it. Remember my generation growing up in the 60s, early 70s, remember that old saying, don't trust anybody over 30. Now that seems ridiculous to us because
Ridiculous. Yeah.
back then somebody over 30 seemed old. Now our kids are just getting launched in their 30s.
Yeah.
I mean, we know there's a delayed adolescence in our society.
Yeah.
And then when a lot of us hit 40, I remember my friends throwing me an over the hill party, which I didn't think was funny. All
No.
the jokes about ARP and all, the black, all of that.
Yeah.
But I think in a sense we do it to ourselves because we joke about it. And then suddenly when we find ourselves at 50, 60, 70, it can be easy to think, oh, this world is for the young, rather than thinking,
Right.
no, I am all the ages I've ever been, like the
Yeah.
rings of the tree. They're all
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
I remember all those lessons. But now there's a seasoned wisdom and maturity, and we better be using that to build into the generations after us. We need to be, but we have to be careful. I hear people my age, Judy, say it all the time. Well, we're old. I'm old. And they'll laugh about it, but we have to be careful. We're not actually being biased against ourselves because we're not too old for the work that God has for us to do.
Yeah.
Maybe some physical things we can't do anymore, and that's fine. But there's other things we can do that we wouldn't have really been qualified to do when we were younger. So I think ageism is the most pervasive form of discrimination there is, because it's not about ethnicity or gender or anything else. It really applies to everybody.
Yeah. So what do you think? How can we combat that in our own minds and in our cultures, in our neighborhoods? Do you have any ideas about how to encourage people to think differently about ageism?
I think by example. Mentoring is, of course, when you sit down with somebody younger and encourage them or answer their questions. But my mentors have mostly been people who were older than I was, whom I watched by example, the things that were important to them. Like it's the older pastor's wife, she's about 15 years older than I am, who's been my mentor for 30 years. And I remember her saying to me, Maggie, when my husband and I turned 60, we decided our primary goal, 60 plus, would be building into the lives of younger people.
And that's what you said your goal is now.
It is, yes, because not only our own children, and if we have them, grandchildren, but for us, our younger pastor, younger staff members. I just joined the mom to mom group at our church. I'm grandmother age for some of the young moms in there, but I just want to be available to them if they need somebody. Maybe they don't, but maybe they don't have a mom around here. For me doing this polar plunge the other day, it required no athletic ability at all. Nothing but putting on a costume and jumping in a pool. That was it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. The head of the organization said to me, Maggie, some of our best volunteers are our 70 plus population. Because they've got time and that they didn't have when they were caregiving.
Right.
So I think the best way we can combat ageism is just to get out there and show people that we're still living and we're not.
And we're willing to jump in cold water in February.
Exactly. People say, you're so brave. And I say, there's nothing brave about it. Nothing brave. It just meant I'm cold for a few minutes, but if I can do some good, the Bible has an awful lot to say about doing good. We don't earn our salvation, but it's a way we demonstrate our faith by doing good to all the people we can for as long as we can.
Yes.
As often as we can.
Absolutely. And in our last few minutes here, do you have any advice for people approaching or who have recently retired?
Oh, I'd say be open. There's nothing wrong with when people talk about golf, gardening, and grandchildren. I mean, you and I have laughed about that. I'm not a golfer. I'm not a gardener. I do love my grandchildren. I wish they didn't live far away. And those things are great. And yes, retirement is a time that many of us hope to be able to travel more, to be able to not have to get up to an alarm clock to take a nap if we want. But also, as we're getting older and we realize that there are more years behind us than there are in front of us, we want to be more intentional about using the time we have. And that means guarding our time that we're not consuming media too much,
Mhm.
that we're still producing and not
That,
simply being consumers.
yes.
And again, just being open to what God has. I never thought I'd be doing some of the volunteer things I've done, but like the polar plunge or
Yeah.
testifying at a hearing or
Yeah. Yeah. Good for
doing a
you.
march simply so I can march with my African American brothers and sisters and listen to their stories.
Yeah.
So I think I would just encourage others to say, many of us retire several times and to be
Yeah.
open to what that means. It
Okay.
can mean very different things for different people.
Good advice. And thank you so much, Maggie, for just spending the time with us and for your wisdom. And I so appreciate it.
You're so welcome. I really appreciate your newsletter, Reimagining Retirement. And, and I'd love, and if somebody's listening to us, I hope they're following your newsletter. And if they'd like to stay in touch with me, I do post I just call it a letter. I used to call it a blog post. It's really a
Yeah.
personal letter. I do it
Yeah.
every Tuesday. If
Yeah.
they'd like to get in touch, they can just find me on my website, which is just maggierowe.com.
Okay.
I'd be happy to have anybody reach out.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Maggie.
You're so welcome. My privilege. Thanks for having me on, Judy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.